Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Sarah A. Bosch Jacobson, the Barbara Rabin Chief Education Officer here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for our 2024 Summer Survivor Speaker Series. Today you will hear from second-generation survivor Phil Glauben. Phil is the son of one of the museum's founders, Max Glauben, who was 11 years old when the Nazis invaded Poland. Max and his family were confined to the Warsaw Ghetto in 1940. After the Ghetto uprising, they were all deported to Majdanek Death Camp. Then Max went on to other concentration camps. He was liberated by the U.S. Army and went on to have a very rich life here in the United States, which Phil will share with you. Max passed away in 2022 at the age of 94 on Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day. He was surrounded by friends, by family, by children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even granddogs when he passed away. So it was a good life. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our community partners for the Summer Survivor Speaker Series, the SMU Human Rights Program, and the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. We are grateful for your support of the museum and our programs. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our board members, and volunteers in the audience. We couldn't fulfill our mission without you, so thank you so much. If you are interested in becoming a museum member or volunteer, please visit our website at dhhrm.org to learn more, or you can stop at the Museum Experience Desk, so the front desk on your way out, and they can help you as well. In just a moment, Phil will share his father's story with you, and then we will have time for questions and answers. If you're joining us in person today, you received an index card and a little golf pencil when you checked in, and our staff will be coming around when Phil is done speaking to collect those from you if you have questions that you would like us to ask of Phil. If you are joining us virtually, please use the Q&A button that is at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions, and we will get to as many of those as we possibly can. I now ask you to silence your cell phones, and for those of you who don't know, turn to the young child next to you. They will help you to do that. And we will all listen to Phil's story without disruptions. Please also refrain from recording today's presentation. We are recording it, and it will be on our museum YouTube channel within the next several days, so you'll be able to rewatch it there if you'd like to. We would like to again thank you for your support, and it is now my pleasure to turn things over to Phil Glauben. Phil?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Those of you who knew Dad knew he was very much larger than life, and it's not an easy story to compile and tell, but I'm going to do my very best to do it justice, and I appreciate, as would he, your being here today to hear his story. I want to point out from the very beginning that I am not a historian. Dates have been confirmed with the museum. I often prayed for a D in history class, and I will do my very best to honor the dates, but the story is the more important part. So I'm a second generation. What does that mean? My father obviously was a survivor, and each of his children are second generation. I'm one. I have a sister, Sherry, and a brother, Barry. We're all second generation. My children, Ross and Sarah, are third generation, and then my grandkids and all the grandkids of all of my siblings are fourth generation. So these are stories that need to continue being told, and I'm proud to be able to do that. The Holocaust was a systematic and state-sponsored murder of 6 million Jews from 1933 to 1945. Dad was born in the midst of that, born January 14th, 1928. He came from a middle-class family in Warsaw, Poland. His father, Isaac, was a newspaper man and worked at the Das Jiddische Tagblatt, which was a Yiddish newspaper. His mother, Feiga, was a housekeeper. He had a younger brother, Henryk, and they lived in a 3-room apartment on Mila 38 in Poland, in Warsaw. He went to public school. He enjoyed math and music. He enjoyed visiting with his family. He enjoyed playing with his brother and their neighborhood friends, and he especially liked playing soccer. They had a simple life compared to what we know today. They had meals together at home every night. There was a bakery next door to their apartment which made, according to him, the very best crusty bread ever, and he spent his life looking for something that was close to that. That bakery, incidentally, left its doors unlocked on Friday afternoons with the ovens. As soon as the ovens were turned off, the ovens remained warm, and neighborhood Jewish families could put their Sabbath meal in the oven before Shabbat began, so it would be ready after shul the next day. When he was 10, the war began, September 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland by Germany and the Nazis. And within 1 month, Warsaw was occupied. Here, my dad will tell you how the citizens of Warsaw learned about the invasion and what young kids did to help their community.
The war broke out on September 1st. By the time they came to Warsaw, it was around October 2nd or what. When the war broke out, the only reason we knew that it broke out was through the radio. They started talking about Germany invaded, then immediately bombs falling. We set up squads of youngsters that we were trained for fire bombs putting out, destroying fire bombs that might not have exploded, or if they exploded and there was a fire that you couldn't use water, you had to use sand. So we were setting up places on top of the roof with sand. Then we would take tape and tape the windows, cross and one in the middle this way, so when the bombs fell, that the glass wouldn't hurt us. Then we were told, if you see bombs falling, stay where you are. Never run, because if you run, that's where the bombs are going to fall.
During the occupation, life in Warsaw changed with new laws implemented by the Nazis, stripping Jews of their civil rights. Jewish people had to register and disclose all of their possessions. They had to wear a white armband with a blue star at all times, similar to this. There was no education allowed for Jewish children, as they were deemed to be unclean. No Jewish teachers. Jews were not allowed to own property. They could have their property removed or looted at any time, including works of art, money, objects of value. Professionals could not practice, doctors and lawyers. And there was a mass anti-Jewish propaganda campaign, billboards, window signs, newspapers depicting Jews as dangerous to German life and responsible for the social and the financial difficulties in Germany. On October 12th, 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto was established, and with the money that was stolen and extorted from Jewish businesses, bricks were purchased, and the Jews were forced to enclose themselves within a 1 square mile area called the Warsaw Ghetto. So the Jews had to build their own brick wall with bricks purchased with their stolen money. Warsaw's Jewish population was 30% of the city's total population, and all of them, roughly 350,000 Jews, were moved into the ghetto. Within the ghetto, there was little food. It had to be smuggled in. There was no running water. There were no facilities. Typhoid and other diseases ran rampant, epidemics. Residents of the ghetto couldn't be on the streets during the day other than to go to work and back, and German soldiers would randomly shoot anyone moving in the streets during certain times of the day. The very young were killed first, thus eliminating the next generation, and the elderly were killed second. They had no value as a worker, and they were the respected pillars of Judaism and the community. German authorities quarantined the area, and no Germans were allowed in because of the possibility of disease. Judenreich was appointed. That was about 2,000 Jewish policemen who enforced German laws against their fellow Jews. All Jews of Warsaw, as I said, were forced to move into the ghetto and bring only what they could carry. Possessions were thrown into pillowcases or into the center of bed sheets with the corners tied. Once the Jews moved into the ghetto, there were about 500,000 people in about 2,700 apartments. Dad's family did not have to move from their apartment as it was already within what became the ghetto, but 3 other families were moved into their 3-room apartment with them. Someone who was working got a ration card allowing them 184 calories a day, for which they waited in long lines. Anyone could be rounded up at any time and taken to Majdanek or Treblinka death camps, and the food lines made it easy to get people all at once, so when the trucks came around, those that were in the food lines scattered. Here, my dad details what he saw and experienced in the Warsaw Ghetto.
I don't know if a person can imagine living in an apartment with clothing that is wore out in shreds, where somebody can only wash themselves with a piece of rag that might be wore out, or in the wintertime, heavenly, with some snow that you bring in and put in a bathtub, or in a sink that you close up because there's no running water, and maybe that's fresher than the water from the Wisla that they sometimes let you bring in. Rodents, rats, because you're not living too much in your apartment, but because of the raids, you do it in the basement that you create as a hiding place. I don't know if you can describe a child and an elderly person that is not allowed to live because they are the victims and they are free game. And let's say they hide and their parents are being taken out, taken away to either Treblinka or Majdanek, and they don't have anybody to care for them. So they live in that apartment and they sit next to each other and they pick their lice out of their hair. And they see something that's moving and maybe they eat it. And then the people that they live in die, and there aren't enough people or undertakers to take the bodies out to the street or to the cemetery. There were handmade cars to carry the bodies to the cemetery. The cemetery had a big grave in the front because there was no room or no equipment to dig graves. There were children lying on the street, skin and bones, because a sweet way to go was freeze by the elements in the wintertime, or die by the elements on there. There were mothers with children singing because they went berserk because of the treatment and the hunger that they were. There were people walking and saying why and praying. Scenes that are unbelievable, because that's what happens when you live under these conditions.
Kids became smugglers to bring in food in hollow areas of carts. Day became night because it was easier to smuggle at night, and basements and cellars became bomb shelters. My father was one of the children who helped smuggle food and messages in and out of the ghetto. Here he is talking about what he did.
That's how I got involved in the smuggling. They had a wagon and a brown, beautiful horse called lalka, which was a doll in Polish. And my father knew the owner, so he worked a little bit there. And a lot of us were messengers with a buy for the next shipment to be smuggled into the ghetto. Couldn't communicate, no telephones, or couldn't use the telephones, no way. So I would get an envelope, and I wouldn't know what was in the envelope. Could have been money, could have been an arrangement to buy something, and I would deliver this to a certain spot there. Now, sometimes they had somebody that was watching, and I couldn't do it, but most of the time I was able to manipulate something. And then I would go out on these trips. I can't tell you how many. Sometimes they used me, sometimes they didn't use me, and sometimes I ran across the gates with a long coat, and sometimes I went through the sewers, but it was done more for the unit that we lived in. Do you understand? Smuggling was a defiant act of fighting against the Germans. That wasn't cowardly. We were saving lives.
On April 19th, 1943, as a birthday gift to Adolf Hitler, whose birthday was the next day, there were orders to liquidate the ghetto. Inhabitants resisted until mid-May. During this time, my father, in addition to smuggling food, would be sent with sealed envelopes, not knowing what was inside, to deliver to certain addresses, and often smuggled sealed envelopes back into the ghetto. The ghetto inhabitants, for 1 month until mid-May, with no real weapons, managed to keep the German forces out of the ghetto until they came in with napalm and flamethrowers. The only place to hide were in basements. Dogs sniffed out those hiding. Grenades were thrown to force people out. The Nazis used listening devices to detect where people were hiding. Dad hid behind the oven in the bakery next door to his apartment, the same oven that made that delicious crusty bread and that cooked his neighbors' Sabbath meals. When people were found alive, they were stripped and searched, and they were taken to a makeshift temporary train station called the Umschlagplatz. They were put on boxcars to either Majdanek or Treblinka. The capo of the German police were told to send 500 people a day because the death camps could only handle about 250 each. No boxcar left with fewer than 100 people in it, and Dad and his family were sent to Majdanek. The trip from Warsaw to Majdanek, which is normally a 2-hour trip by train, took 5 days because regular rail service stayed on schedule and the Jewish boxcars were placed on side rails or spurs to allow regular trains to pass. In this clip, my father tells of the conditions he experienced during his deportation.
So there's a lot of people, and you see some of the Jewish capos there and some Germans with guns and bayonets, and you are nobody, and you get mingled up, and I don't even know whether, I know that my little brother was with me, but I don't know where he was by the time we were loaded into the boxcar, because like you're going into a theater or you're coming out of theater and you might be there with your spouse, and then somebody walks in right in the middle and they were pushing you in, and we were being loaded not on a platform but a 4x8 plywood with some 2x4s or 1x1s on there. So once you get on there and you do slide down, you don't go to the end, you can still climb up. And then the boxcars sometimes had rubbish on there, body parts, clothing parts, and they might have taken 2 or 3 or 4 trips. They never washed them. The smell impregnated in the wood because there were no toilets on there, no water. That's what I describe, in there. So we finally were pushed on there, and then the door locked from the outside.
When they arrived at Majdanek, there was a 1.5 kilometer, about a mile walk from the train to the camp, which they had to do marching. Upon arrival, everyone went through selection. Able-bodied men were sent one direction to be sent to a work camp, and women and children were sent the other direction to buildings marked Brausabad, meaning bathhouse or disinfecting house, to prevent hysteria. That was written on the outside of gas chambers. At selection, Dad's father was sent to work, and he and his brother and his mother were sent to the gas chambers. At the last moment, my dad's father grabbed his hand and said, "Stay with me." It was allowed, and that was the first moment I realized that Dad's life was saved. Dad later learned that his mom and brother became separated, and when she was looking for him, because her eyes were swollen due to dehydration, she was sent to the dispensary and never seen again. Dad didn't know what happened to his brother Henyek, although I recently found him listed as murdered in Majdanek in the book of 6 million names that resides at Auschwitz Memorial. My father explains how his family got separated at Majdanek.
So when they started selecting, they said women and children forward, and all the men there were left. I was next to my father and my mom, my little brother, and all my other relatives. So when they went ahead, I went with them. And my father grabbed my hand, "Stay with me." And I was pretty close to his size, and the Germans allowed it. Then they put us into a portable building, and I don't remember how long I stood there. But overnight, that night, slept just on the floor. There were like sheds, portable buildings. They didn't have any toilets or food or anything. You just lay there. And we had clothing that was unbelievable and filled after 5 days. But anyways, then was either the next day or, to be true, I cannot, time does not mean anything, just light and dark, light and dark. And then we were taken on another boxcar and taken to Budzin.
Only a day later, he and his father were sent to Budzin, a work camp in Poland. I'd like to point out that there were death camps like Majdanek and Treblinka, and there were also work camps which were established to take advantage of free slave prison labor, and all of those supported the war effort. The work camps were always adjacent to industrial efforts, many of those supporting the Nazi war effort. Budzin had about 3,000 prisoners and was next to a Heinkel airplane factory. Upon arrival, they were sent to a big room with overhead showers. Dad and the prisoners were stripped, sprayed with lye soap, then rinsed with a big fire hose. There was death by trampling, water pressure, and they were sent to the next room and sprayed with DDT and given random clothing which did not fit. Dad and his dad were asked if they could read blueprints to make patterns for airplane parts, and although they didn't even know what a blueprint was, of course they said yes, which began his career as a pattern maker in several camps. Budzin was in the charge of a Commander Fikes who was particularly brutal. There was reveille every morning in the Appel plots, the gathering area, and all prisoners were counted and had to wait for Commander Fikes to arrive and accept the count. They could be waiting in 0-degree weather for 2 or 3 hours, and those who fell went to the dispensary, out the back door, into a ditch. Fikes would ride his white horse behind the prisoners, single out 1 or 2 to whip to death, saying that bullets were too good. Dad became a pattern maker for Heinkel Airplane Factory, and they had to march in sections from the camp to the factory based on their assignments at Heinkel. You went to the outhouse on a schedule and went back to camp for lunch on a schedule, each time marching in cadence and singing. Failure to do so resulted in death. You would have 1 piece of bread a day and some soup of varying nutritional value based on what was available, such as potato peels. This is where my dad's dad died, and I will let my dad tell you more.
It was about 3 weeks into the camp when we went out on a Friday morning and came back in the evening, and they miscounted some people and stated that there were 3 people missing. My father was taken as a hostage. And what I never say, but I had a very high temper. And my father kept on saying, Moniak, lose your temper, be calm. Because you, like people like right now when I'm driving, my wife says, be careful, don't. So I learned how to control it after that. He says, when they took him away from me, he says, you will survive, but lose your temper. Those are the last words. And ever since then, I became more at ease, but still, don't mess with me, because I still, have it in that. So when he was taken a hostage, he was holding my hand, and they took him away from me, and I wanted to go with him, and no way, when we want you, we'll let you know when we want you. So they laid him out on the ground in the middle of the Appel Square with the face down, and I know there was another man that was from Warsaw. I don't know his name, but I can see his face right now. And he must have been laying next to my father or what. It was Friday night. I went into the barracks crying, and I don't know if I remember if I slept or not. When we got up Saturday morning to go to work, half of the bodies were gone, and only the shoes, and my father's shoes, which were boots, were there.
Next camp he was sent to was Mielec. There was an engineer in charge of this camp, and at this camp, which was placed near a Heinkel airplane factory, he continued to be a pattern maker. Dad's hand is the one on the far right, and this is the camp. Mielec is where he received his tattoo, KL, which stood for Konzentrationslager, or concentration camp. And this tattoo was given with a single needle by hand. In all, about 1,500 people received that tattoo. 61 who received that tattoo survived the war. I was with him in Flossenburg a few years ago, and we managed to meet 3 other people who had the same tattoo, and I took the photo of those 4. I had never seen another. He kept that tattoo all his life, and he did not want it to be removed. He was sent briefly after Mielec to a camp called Wieliczka, which was actually a salt mine, an underground salt mine, about 12 kilometers from Auschwitz-Birkenau. There was an airplane production facility underground in the salt mines, but he didn't work here. He described the camp as being in chaos with fields of bodies, dead or dying, no sleep, no food, not enough facilities, and he was only there for about 2 to 3 weeks. After that, 2,700 able-bodied workers were transported to Flossenburg, and he arrived there on August 4th, 1944, and was there until April 16th, 1945, housed in Block 11. Now, Flossenburg, to this very day, is an operational granite quarry owned by Germany. The stone that was mined there was used to build the grand buildings of the Nazi Reich. But in 1945, the Nazis needed more airplanes than they needed more buildings. So wooden buildings were quickly built on the grounds of the quarry to be a Messerschmitt production facility. So the prisoners who were at Flossenburg, some went to work in the quarry and some went to work at Messerschmitt, both at the same place. As the war was ending and due to the advancing Allied forces from the northeast, the Nazis wanted to destroy evidence of the treatment of the prisoners at the camp, and they began to move all able-bodied prisoners towards Dachau on a series of death marches. There was only one death march for Jews, and that began on April 16th, 1945. Listen to my dad, please, detailing the moment that their train was met by American planes.
The train consisted of enough boxcars to hold about 2,400 Jewish people, guards in the doorway guarding us, 2 locomotives, one in the front and one in the back. The moment the train leaves, and I think they described it around Schwarzenfeld, Germany, the American fighter planes came and shut up the train parallel, disabled both locomotives, killed the Germans that were standing in the doorways, and they thought it was a train of German soldiers. I was kneeling down inside the boxcar, and I ended up with brains and body parts of human beings all over me. They took us out of the boxcar, all bloody. They put us on another train. That train leaves, come the British. They disable the 2 locomotives, then start diving down, and we see the Germans looking, and you see every 5th bullet is like a firecracker. It tells the pilot whether they're hitting the object or not. The Germans see them coming, they jump off, and of course we jump off. By the time we lay down on the ground, the pilots see who is really in the cars. They just kill a few of us, fire a few of the shots, and fly away.
After the train was disabled, the death march continued on foot. The prisoners wandered through the countryside, and they came to a hilly area in Stammsried, and they were led to the top of a hill and told by the German soldiers to stay there, that they were surrounded by soldiers below that had rifles, and if anyone tried to run down the hill to escape, they would be shot on sight. I want to point out the sketch on the far left was given to me on a recent trip to Flossenburg, and that is a sketch of a death march. The steeple that you might be able to see in the very back of the sketch is also pictured in the photograph. So we were right there where that happened, and you will see a photo in a moment that shows that the German government has now erected some stones at locations where death marches concluded. My dad will talk about the moments leading up to his liberation and the first experiences with American soldiers.
So about 7 or 8 of us tested our legs after we heard a roar of engines back in the town. And what it did see that we could watch one machine gun, but we didn't know how many there were there. But we saw the Germans tearing off the SS insignias and tearing off some of the stripes to make the uniforms seem like no ranks and that they weren't who they were. And we saw them getting away, but we didn't know it was kind of far away and there was vegetation. So you can see movement and maybe something doing something, but like in between the thing. When we heard the roar, 7 or 8 of us decided that we are going to try to run through the machine guns because singularly we would be dead ducks. So we tested and then we started. So we ran back into the town. When we got to the bottom, it was American tanks. And then all the German windows were open and people, white bed sheets, pillowcases out of the window, they were surrendering to the American soldiers. So they felt like if they hand out, nobody's going to kill them. They thought they're going to be killed.
The prisoners were abandoned in the German countryside on April 21st, 1945. After 2 days of wandering, looking for a displaced persons or DP camp, on April 23rd, 1945, they encountered 3rd U.S. Army, 90th Division, 179th Signal Repair Corps, which came down the road. In charge was Second Lieutenant Basic, who told the small group, "You kids aren't going to make it to a DP camp, and I'm not going to let you die." He adopted the small group, and he gave them U.S. Army uniforms, and they roamed with the Corps. Lieutenant Basic called them his helpers. The Corps took over the empty Neumeier Cable Works factory in Nuremberg. He stayed with them for 2 years. He learned English, he bought his first car, he learned to cook for 600 German POWs and 200 Polish guards. 2 years later, in 1947, when the troops were sent elsewhere, he went to a Gloucesterhausen orphanage near Heidelberg, and while he was there, he got to play soccer again. Someone from Children's Service asked him to help transport some orphaned babies from an orphanage to the U.S., which ensured his immediate passage, and he came to the U.S. in mid-December 1947 on a converted merchant marine ship USS Marine Flasher to New York, where he lived in a boarding house in the Bronx. He didn't like New York, so he asked to move, and he went to Atlanta via Eastern Airlines, lived in a foster home. When he turned 18, he received his permanent visa, and he registered for the draft in 1948. He was drafted into the U.S. Army, sent to Fort Hood, where he served from 1951 to 1953 on active duty, 1st Armored Division, 707th Battalion. The experience that he had cooking for 800 people per day while in Nuremberg served him well because he became a mess sergeant at Fort Hood. While in Fort Hood, he used to go to Dallas for R&R on the weekends, and he met my mom at a dance, and they got married June 14th, 1953. Mom is here today. Wave. I was born a year later, followed by a sister, Sherry, 3 years later, and then favorite son, Barry, was born 6 years after that. From their marriage, there were 3 kids, 7 grandkids, and until 3 months ago, 3 great-grandkids, all of whom are my grandkids. On 4/22/24, thank God for palindromes, Ross and Stacy, my son and daughter-in-law, had a little boy, and they named him Max Glauben. Stacy is also the granddaughter of a survivor, David Kaplan, who lived in El Paso. So Max's real name is Max David Glauben, which is particularly fitting that he would have the name of 2 very strong men. With barely a 4th grade education, Dad went on to build a very successful business. He was a beloved father, grandfather, and even great-grandfather, and he pledged to himself that he would tell his story to all who would listen so that an event like the Holocaust would not happen again. He became a founder of this museum, the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, which tells not only the story of the Holocaust, but other genocides which have occurred. He was awarded an honorary doctorate during COVID from SMU, and he was selected as Dallas Morning News' Texan of the Year in 2020. He saw his biography published in 2021 called The Upstander, and he was selected by this museum to be filmed using holographic technology, and he has permanent residence in the Dimensions and Testimony exhibit. Today, I understand, is Fridays with Max, which happens every Friday. That he's the guy in the holographic theater. Even past his death, he can answer 2,000 questions in that special theater. Most important to him, he was awarded the Hope for Humanity Award from this museum in November 2021, just 5 months before his death, April 28th, 2022, on Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Dad would not want you to feel pity for him after hearing his story. Instead, he would want you to learn some important lessons from it. I'll share a couple of his favorites with you now. He often said, God gave each of us the most powerful computer, our brain. You are in charge of programming yours. Program it for understanding, compassion, and doing good deeds. A few years ago, he was at Auschwitz on an educational trip and saw several German shepherds guiding vision-impaired visitors. He asked to have a picture taken with the visitors and the dogs, and when asked why, he said, in the camps, these dogs were trained to maim and kill upon command, and now these same dogs have been trained to be helpful. He somehow thought people could be educated similarly. Hate corrodes the vessel which contains it. Dad believes that hate and anger hurt the person feeling the hatred more than the target of hate, often incapacitating them. He also believed that the antidote to hate, prejudice, intolerance isn't love alone, but rather education. The more we learn about and understand someone else, the more we cultivate empathy and acceptance and realize how much more we are alike than different. At Majdanek, in the back of the former death camp today, a museum and memorial site, among the trenches where people were shot and pushed into mass graves, there is a mausoleum, pictured here, which at the top of the steps contains 17 tons of ashes, bone, and teeth. He called this the Mound of Lost Opportunity. In these and other ashes, who might have cured cancer? Who might have written a great novel? Who might have solved the problem of homelessness or mental illness or cancer? We will never realize the potential that lies there. It doesn't seem enough to tell Dad's story without thinking about why it's important to tell it, as well as the stories of other survivors. Dad would say it's because the Holocaust could happen again. For me, the stories serve as a reminder of how cruel and mean one person can be to another given the right circumstances. Dad's is one of millions of stories of those who endured World War II. Each story is different. Some had better outcomes than others. All of the things I described that happened to Dad and his family happened for one reason. They were Jewish. They weren't criminals. They were Jewish. The most powerful way to explain why we must continue to tell these stories came to me actually through a cartoon that Dad had posted above his desk. The cartoon shows an old man sitting on a park bench next to a child, and they're talking. The child says, "Mister, that's an awfully boring tattoo on your arm. It's just a bunch of numbers." The old man replies, "I was just about your age when I got it, and I kept it as a reminder." The child says, "As a reminder of what? Happier days?" The man replied, "No, of a time when the world went mad." He continued, "Imagine yourself in a land where your countrymen followed the voice of political extremists who didn't like your religion. Imagine having everything taken from you, your entire family sent to a concentration camp as slave laborers, then systematically murdered. At the camp, they even took your name and they replace it with a number tattooed on your arm. It was called the Holocaust, when millions of people perished just because of their faith." The child, shown crying, said, "So you kept it to remind yourself about how horribly one person can treat another?" And the old man replied, "No, my dear child. I kept it to remind you." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. If any of you have questions that you would like to ask Phil about himself or his father, please hold your index cards up. We have staff that's coming around. I need to share a photo with you that I have of your dad. We went in 2016 to Texas A&M when Richard Spencer was starting to talk against Jews around the country, and Max flew out for the day to give a talk in their stadium, and right before he spoke, 4 or 5 Yell Squad members came in. They met him, shook his hand like he was a celebrity. He met them, shook their hands like they were celebrities. There's this photo of Max and these giant Yell Squad guys, I don't have it up here, standing with each other. And afterwards, your father wanders over to me and says, "Who were they?" It was adorable. But he's like, "Oh, this is the best." He had no idea. Anyway, the first question.
Interesting full circle is that Rebecca Lopez, who's there, Rebecca, hi, reporter for Channel 8 for a lot of years, called me, and she's one of the reasons that Dad was
Went
there
out
that
there.
day. That's right.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here, Rebecca.
So the first question, this came from somebody who's watching via Zoom, is when did you decide to start sharing your father's story?
So I never even thought that it would ever be a possibility because he was so much larger than life, and he didn't think he was ever going anywhere. And then when he received an unfavorable medical diagnosis, he asked me to be the one who would continue to tell his story. Not that he liked me better, although he liked my brother better, but not that he thought I was any smarter, but I had traveled with him a couple of times to Poland and 7 or 8 times to Flossenburg. So I had walked in his footsteps with him at those places, and he felt like I had an understanding. And it just felt like a natural obligation that should be fulfilled, and I was happy to say yes.
Okay. Do you know if your father was ever caught smuggling goods and supplies in or out of the Warsaw Ghetto? And what happened to smugglers who were caught? Do you have any sense of that?
I don't really. I don't believe he ever was caught. He described the secrecy of envelopes and what was inside and addresses to which they went, and I think they were probably, that was to protect him and any other smugglers from knowing what was inside. Okay. I don't know.
Okay. We do know historically.
You're the historian, you might know.
Well, we know that child smugglers, if they were caught bringing food in, could be killed. They could be beaten, they could be jailed, or very easily they could be shot. So, okay. Did your dad ever talk about his experiences and how they affected his Judaism, his Jewish belief and faith?
He did, and he actually, for those, this is a shameless plug to go to the Dimensions and Testimony, because he answers that very well himself. He was always a man of faith. In my heart of hearts, because he spoke. If you ask him the question in the DIT, how did you survive? He thinks for a second and then he says, I cheated, I lied, I made myself seem better than other people. And he, while he rationalized it as being what helped him survive, I also think he had difficulty because I think it went against his nature. There was no more of an upstanding citizen, not in the terms of the museum's upstander, but there was nobody who wanted to follow the rules more. And he talked about his faith and about his belief and how that guided him in the camps. And sometimes, what does Carrie Underwood sometimes say? Jesus, in her song, Jesus Take the Wheel. He sometimes just let God take it.
Yeah, okay. After the war ended, do you know if any of the Nazi officials that your dad encountered in the ghetto or camps were arrested and brought to justice?
I do not.
Okay.
Interestingly, so he was in Nuremberg for the 2 years following the war, and the tribunal began just months after his liberation date. And he was there, and he would talk about the daily radio and the daily news and hearing about it, but I don't know that anybody who touched him directly was tried.
Yeah, and I can say that he never spoke about that either, nor did the researcher who helped write his autobiography say anything about it either. So my guess is that it didn't happen. Can you give a little bit more about the specifics of when your father immigrated to the U.S.? Because you talked about that he didn't like New York and he went to Atlanta. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I can talk about it a little bit. So after he was with the U.S. forces for 2 years and came to the United States, he left Neumeier Cable Works, which became the Army Barracks, and he went to an orphanage, a Gloucesterhausen. And he was there for a short amount of time, and he was, of course, coming to the United States at that time was a little bit different, and there were quotas and there were timetables, and he actually was guided to lie about his age to make himself a year and a half younger so that he could still take advantage of what was offered by Children's Services, which made it a mess when he turned 65 and tried to get Social Security, but it was another story for another time.
I remember him talking about having 3 birthdays, and which one did you want to know about?
Exactly. But because there were some orphaned, literally babies, little infants, who were coming to the United States for adoption, he was made the deal, if you would accompany, it wasn't him alone, there were 2 or 3 others who accompanied these children, and it guaranteed them immediate passage. So he bypassed the lines by agreeing to bring babies. And he did that. He came through Ellis Island, and he was assigned to Mrs. Rosenthal in a boarding house in the Bronx. And I remember him, and it's in DIT, he talked about going to see the Rockettes, and I think it was on New Year's Eve. And he felt so alone. It was a festive time of year. Christmas, we all know how familial that time of year is, and he wasn't feeling that. And he decided that New York was not the place for him. So I found, in fact, I don't know if Felicia's in here, the archivist here. I found the Eastern Airlines ticket on New Year's Eve passage from New York City to Atlanta. And he went to Atlanta, and he loved being there. He was a shoe salesman for a while, and he and a buddy opened a grocery store. I found the tax return as I was cleaning out his effects, and I think it netted $7,000 or $8,000 that he split with his partner, and that was a lot of money back then. So it was a different time, but he was happy to be here, and he loved, once he came to Dallas, he loved Dallas. He never lived anywhere else, and he appreciated all the opportunities that he had here in the United States. He was a big fan.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how your father got involved in efforts to create a museum here in Dallas?
Yes. So actually, I didn't really, I knew growing up that my father was a Holocaust survivor, but I had absolutely no idea what that meant. We didn't talk about it at home. He didn't talk about it. And it was when I was in high school in 1972, I think the movie The Holocaust came on TV, and that seemed to open the floodgates, not only for Dad, but for a lot of the Holocaust survivors. And there were quite a few very influential, very many survivors who were influential in the founding of the museum, and they wanted a place where they would feel comfortable talking about their experiences, having school groups come and hear about it, and that became a moment when they collectively tried to create something that would be lasting, that would tell their story.
Okay. Could you share a bit more about your dad and what he experienced at Liberation? Specifically, what was his health like at this time? Did he have to take time to recover? And did he have any sense of what he wanted to do next?
Interestingly, and he said this to me more than once, he said, shocking viewpoint, he said, at least in the camps, I knew I was going to get 184 calories a day. Once I was liberated, I had no idea where my next meal was going to come from, whatever you want to categorize a meal. Horribly, he described that at Liberation, at the death marches, which the prisoners knew was the end of the war. Many of them did. I can't imagine what it would be like to have come through so much and to be murdered, shot, even by friendly fire or not, in the last moments of what had been endured. And he spoke of that some of the people alongside him on the death march, when they were liberated and were given food, they were given unlimited food. And that killed some of the prisoners at the last moment because their bodies could not handle the digestion of that at the last minute. So he got lucky. He talked about some of the people in the countryside let him sleep in a barn and gave him a meal and then threw him out the next day because there was still the mass sense of something's going to happen to us as non-Jews helping Jews.
Okay. This is the last question that we have. We have some young people in the audience today. Are there any words of advice or anything that you would like to leave them with as the next generation? Because you are the next generation. You picked up the mantle. So what would you like them to know?
Well, I'm going to stick with the message of the museum. The museum's written right outside the door on a big red wall. It says "Upstander." So on an everyday basis, we might hear jokes that could be demeaning, or we might hear comments made to our classmates, or we might hear things. And the message of the museum, and I think maybe one of Dad's strongest messages, although he didn't use the same words, was confront that. Confront bigotry. Confront prejudice. Confront bullying. Do your part. The power of one is strong. And do your part, and the world will be better for it.
Thank you so much, Phil, for joining us today
Thank
and
you,
for
Sarah.
sharing your dad's story, and really it's your story as well.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for joining us. Our next survivor speaker will be Miss Rosie Ann Zerner. She will be speaking Friday, August 9th. And our concluding summer survivor speaker will be Mr. Bert Romberg, who was a Kindertransport child. He will be speaking on August 16th. We hope that you can join us, and you are welcome to register by visiting www.dhhrm.org. The final thing I would say is that I'm hoping Phil will stay here a few more minutes after the program, so if you'd like to come up and meet him, by all means, please do. And thank you again. I hope you all have a good afternoon.
Thank you all.